So now we get started with this basic user interface here. How should we now continue? Well, there are of course different ways of continuing, and of course we will need to build this chart and this expense list widget ultimately. But I want to start by creating a model as a first step in a separate models folder that I just created here in this lib folder. Of course, you don't have to create this models folder, but I want to organize my files and kind of group them by functionality or feature. Inside of this models folder, we will create a Dart file, which I'll name expense.dart, where I simply want to describe which data structure an expense in this app should have. So which kind of structure an expense should have. And for that, in this expense.dart file, we can create a class which now won't be a widget, so where we won't extend stateful or stateless widget. And it's a class which I'll name expense. And of course, we have created a data model before in this course already. Here in this app, I'll do it again because we'll work a lot with such expenses, and a single expense will be made up of different data points, which I simply want to group together in such a custom class, in such a custom object blueprint. So which kind of data should be grouped into a single expense? Well, I definitely want to have the title there, so I'll add a property, a final property of type string, which I'll name title. I also definitely want to have the amount, and that should be of type double, which is a number with decimal places, so that we also support amounts like 1.99, for example. And besides title and amount, I also want to have a unique ID per expense, which then allows us to identify that expense later on, which is some information that we, for example, need to delete expenses. So therefore, I'll add an ID property, and this will also be of type string. You could also use an integer ID to have IDs like 1, 2, 3, and so on, but here I'll generate a string ID, some unique string, so that every expense has its own unique ID. And we'll soon add some code that takes care of generating such an ID automatically. Now I also want to have a date attached to every expense. And for this we can use the built-in datetime data type, which is a data type built right into Dart. So we don't have to import anything, we can use it like this. And datetime is simply a special data type that allows us to store date information in a single value. And with that here, I added 4 properties that, for this application which we're building here, should describe a single expense. Now, of course, we also need a constructor function that can be called to, well, build such an expense object based on this blueprint. And therefore here, I want to accept a couple of arguments, a couple of parameters. And we could use positional parameters here, but here, since I'll need a couple of parameters, I'll actually go for named parameters, because if you expect more than 2 or 3 parameters in a function or in a constructor function like here, I personally find it easier to call that constructor function if you can target the different parameters by name instead of having to remember their position and passing data in the right order to that function. Using named parameters can simply be a bit easier here. Therefore here I want to accept a named title parameter to assign a value to title. And this should be required with help of the required keyword here. The same is the case for the amount. I want to accept this as well, and it should also be required. Then I also want to require the date parameter. And for the ID here, I actually don't want to require this as a parameter. Instead, I want to build such a unique ID dynamically whenever a new expense object is created. And to do that, I'll use a third-party package, the UUID package, which you can install into your Flutter project with this command here, like this, so that we can use this package to generate unique IDs, because that's what this package is all about. So with this installed, here in this expense.dart file, we can import from this UUID package and there from the UUID Dart file. And this then gives us an object, or a class to be precise, which we can instantiate to get an object, the UUID class, which we can call like this, to create an object based on it, which I'll store in a final variable called UUID. And I do this outside of my class here because it doesn't belong to this class necessarily. Instead, it's just a utility object, which we can now use anywhere in this file to generate unique IDs. And I want to generate a unique ID for this expense class whenever it is instantiated. And for this, we can add a so-called initializer list after the closing parenthesis of this constructor function here by adding a colon. And after this colon, you can also initialize the properties of this class to which this constructor function belongs. So therefore here we can then, for example, target the ID property here and assign an initial value that will be assigned when this object is created, so when this constructor function is called. And here I want to use this UUID utility object. And on that object, there is a v4 method along with a couple of other methods, but it's the v4 method which I want to use here, which generates a unique string ID. So this then generates a unique ID and assigns it as an initial value to the ID property whenever this expense class is initialized. This initializer list feature here is a Dart feature. UUID is this third-party package which we added. And here we can now also add const, since UUID supports this const constructor. And since we can add it here, we can actually also add it here to turn this entire variable into a const value which we can't reassign and which we create such that the value can be stored in memory and could be reused by Dart if we would use it somewhere else in our code as well.